Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Tip of the Week. We've been talking about particles in the last couple of weeks, and I wanted to continue along talking about particles. Last week we talked about the emitter. This week I also want to continue talking about the emitter. So let's take a look here at another example. I've got my fire example here, and I decided to come back to the fire example because the fire example has some good things to show you in terms of what it's doing with the rendering strategy. Well, let's just do a recap, a little bit of what we did last week. We get to, first of all, define how many different types or shapes of particle there is. So there's 5 frames of particles here. The first particle is on frame 1 and the last particle is on frame 5. And here, there's no information for the age. So the age is just going to start and it's going to age naturally. So we'll start at frame 1 always. And then if we go into the number of particles here, it's creating 20 particles in every frame with 100% probability, so every frame it will create 20 particles. Now that's pretty much what we did last week. Now let's look in the rendering tab. So in the rendering tab, here down now at the bottom is where you get to define how the particles really look. And there's also this size. So we're going to talk today about the size and about the color and the compositing. So let's start with the size. The size determines, obviously how big the particle is, but the size really it's defined over age, and so the size will change as the particle gets older. So if we look at this, we can see right away that there's a function that's defined for this. So let's take a look at what the function looks like. So if I pop open the function editor, I can see that the size there at the beginning starts at 1.6 or thereabouts. If I raise that up, you'll see how they get bigger at the beginning because they're younger at the beginning. And if I move it down, then they're going to get smaller. So the size, you can even keyframe the size over time. So, I can change it so the particles get really small at the end, or maybe I want them smaller in the middle. And this is so cool, the idea that you can actually change the size of the particles over time. You can do a lot with this. And you can even adjust the curves on that to show how it's going to go from one keyframe to another keyframe. But you might notice that in addition to actually animating the size over time, this example also is animating the color over time. Now, when I like to deal with color, I think it's easier to go in your timeline. I usually work with 2 screens because my screen here is a little bit small, but because I'm working on this demo, I'll try to do this all on one screen. So I like to show the data view. I don't know if you guys use the data view that much. I'm a big fan of the data view because what the data view allows you to do is it allows you to look at the properties of the different elements directly right here. And then what I can do is I can select my emitter here in the network view, and then I'll go down into my timeline and I'll hit O or Shift O to zoom me over to the layer that I'm looking at. So then I can see here that I'm looking at the emitter. But the emitter has many different functions that are attached to it. So if I want to see those functions, I'll just click on the plus sign, and that shows me all of the different functions that can be animated over time. And so you have there your red, green, blue, and alpha. So I like to show this just to see where the keyframes are. So I can select the first keyframe there, and then with that keyframe selected, I can just pop on this color and it's going to open up the color window, and then I can adjust the color. So let's just do it drastically so that you can see. So I'm going to do blue. And then I can go to the next keyframe, which is where? Let's see, sorry, my window is too small. So I'll go to my next keyframe, which is on frame 40, and then I'll click on the window here again, and then I'll change it to green. So you can see there how you can adjust it without having to go in there and really futz with the properties. If you want to go to an intermediate color in the middle, you can just move your playhead to the middle, click on the color, and then add a new keyframe directly in there without having to go outside. So that's really nice that you don't have to really go in, like you don't have to adjust the RGB values separately. You can use this color window right here to do that. And then from there, now how does it actually appear on top of whatever's behind it? So just to show what I mean by that, let's just import an image in that I can use as a background image here. Let's go into my images that I like to use. test images. There we go. Alright, so I've got this kind of a generic looking background there. Whoops, I should not vectorize it when I import it in. Let's do that again. I'll import in my generic background and I will not vectorize it. There we go. Okay, so my background is kind of this city street with some red on it. I'll just close that emitter for a second so that I can go in here and take my background and extend the exposure on my background with F5. So now I've got my fire here down there at the bottom, and I've got some frames going on there. Now if I check out what's going on in the emitter, if I look at what I can do in the Compositing tab down here, there are different blend modes, first of all, that you can apply. And so it's really cool to be able to change the blend mode that you use. I'll just put this back to orange because I think it shows up a little bit, or maybe even red, shows up a little bit better against this background. And then we'll just do a render of this frame. So I'll pop this guy out for a render, and I'll just take a second to render it. So when you have it on screen, it kind of lightens up the background. I'll change it back to normal so that you can see what it looks like when it's on normal. Let me just make sure I have my auto render turned on. There we go. Okay, so let's change this a little bit. Some of the colors are maybe a bit too dark there. Okay, so that's what it looks like on normal. And then if I put it on multiply, it will apply that multiply so that it kind of adds itself to the background. Screen is the one that's kind of useful for doing stuff like fire because it really makes it look like fire. But of course now I've changed all the colors of my fire so it doesn't show up so well. But on top of doing these different blend mode options, let's just turn this back to normal for the sake of you being able to see it a little bit better. On top of doing the blend mode options, you can also adjust the color. So let's put this back up to orange. But you can also adjust the blur. So you can blur from a couple of things. You can blur based on the age of the particle. So if you want to blur based off of the age, it's useful for if you want the blur to change as it gets older. If you want to blur based off of the camera distance, then it's useful for if you want to put keyframes on the blur depending on how close or far away it is from the camera. And if you want to blur based off the frame, it means you want all the particles to be more or less blurry together on different frames. So basically, when you choose age, frame, or camera distance, that means that those that parameter, age or frame, is the parameter that's going to be on sort of the y-axis of your, or sorry, on the x-axis of your function. So in other words, if you blur based off the frame, the y-axis of your function is how blurry it is, and then the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, is which frame you're on. Whereas you can change, instead of it being the frame, you can change that to the camera distance, or you can change it to the age, and you can get different effects. But let's just do it based off of the age now. I'll do a low quality blur based off of the age. And since I still have the render on, it's calculating the thing right away. But I can adjust here how blurry it is, and then you can see that parameter being adjusted directly there in my window. And it will just take a second because I'm working on a very low powered machine. There we go. So now we've got some blur on that guy. And maybe my background is a little bit too complex to look at, so I can turn that off as well if I just want to see what it looks like on a black background. And depending on how many particles you have, the more particles you have, the more time it takes to calculate, you know, like you'd think it would, because for each particle it has to calculate kind of where that particle is and so on. So this is what it looks like with a lot of blur, and then this is what it looks like, you know, with not so much blur. Excuse me. And then when you do change the parameters of this, if you have your system set to auto render, then it's going to re-render every time you change something. So you can change that property here in your render tab, excuse me, in the render section of your camera view. You can change whether it is on auto render or not. So let's just turn this back to OpenGL for a second, then I can click and hold on this one. And if auto render is checked, then it will render every time you change something. Whereas if you uncheck it, which I probably should do on my low-powered machine, then it will only render when you hit that button. So you can go into render view and then hit that button and it will render. So that's it for this week. I mean, we've covered pretty much all of the emitter. You know, we went over last week a lot of the generation properties, and then we went over a lot of the rendering properties this week. There are a couple of extra ones that you might see, like axis to align. Sometimes you might want to align an axis. This is useful for if you're doing something like a walk cycle on a character, so you can check out the Lemmings example for that one. And then there's a little bit of additional stuff down here. This advanced stuff down here is for when you want to create one particle system out of another particle system. So in other words, you can have one particle that creates another particle as a child. And that's kind of like if you want to do fireworks or something like that. So that advanced stuff I'm not going to cover in tip of the week, but this, at least going over together the emitter properties, hopefully gives you a lot better of a sense of how you can adjust the basic parameters of your system. And then we can go over next week a little bit of how you can add certain different actions to this system and how the actions work. So I'll see you guys next week.